So this is the lecture on the Pentateuch for the rest of the balance, the majority of your first week's readings in Intro to the Bible. Begin with chapter 5, um, which is basically a brief overview of some of the theories on where the Pentateuch has come from. Who wrote the Pentateuch? The Pentateuch, again, are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are their most common English names. And they are fundamental, crucial in both the Jewish and the Christian traditions, really setting the tone in some ways, deserving their spot. No matter what the canons are, these 5 books are at the head. Again, we talked about the various different canons, but they're at the beginning, and they kind of deserve their place there, spelling out the story that the Old Testament is supposedly giving. And the author of them has traditionally been held to be Moses, but there are some questions about that. Anybody who reads them will see them right away. For instance, at the end of Deuteronomy, there's a narration of Moses' death. So the question is, who narrated? Did Moses narrate that and then just fulfill what he did? And then there's a lot of these kind of statements like, until this day, such and such is still true, such and such a thing happened, and we still see it practiced today. That sounds awfully like a time skip, right? If Moses is writing until the future, what does he mean until this day? So there have always been these kind of questions. Maybe we can trace an oral tradition to someone, we could call Moses or something like that. But the most famous modern kind of beginning to this question began in the 19th century, especially with what's called the documentary hypothesis now, which has been more or less the foundation for a lot of Old Testament studies. And this one sets out in the beginning, it was really the noticing that there are various names, for instance, used before God. There's Yahweh, which is often translated. If you're wondering, where is Yahweh in my Bible, in my English Bible that I have. If you've ever heard the word Jehovah or even Lord God, right? When this term Lord is used, that word Lord is often standing in for this Hebrew, what is called the Tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, 4 letters in Hebrew. And this is Yahweh, probably pronounced something like Yahweh, by the ancient Israelites and the writers of these documents. That term is used, favored for God sometimes, and then other times another phrase, Elohim, for God, Yahweh, Elohim. And so people have, the documentary hypothesis suggested maybe these are 2 sources, a Yahwist and an Elohist. Y or J, depending, because the German J is similar to the English Y, and a lot of these theorists were first in Germany. There's this source, this J source, we could call it, the E source for Elohist. Then we have a Deuteronomic source, possibly, for Deuteronomy and similar materials. And then P, a priestly source. And so, because of the different motivations, the different language, the different styles, the different interests and themes, people have considered that there are possibly these up to 4 or more. Sometimes they get very fine-grained, as the authors point out. Yahwist 1, Yahwist 2. Various points, and you can go as much into this as you want. Obviously, in this kind of introductory textbook, we're not going to go into all the details. People have written whole doctoral theses on these kind of things. The textbook particularly is moving in the direction of a lot of modern scholarship that de-emphasizes E. E is kind of scattered, so maybe it's not a separate entire source, and so we're mainly dealing with, if we want to simplify it, 3 kind of sources: the Yahwist, the priestly source, and the Deuteronomic source. And we're also thinking about P, priestly, as possibly an editor. Although, there's this kind of question: is the Yahwist before P and D, or is it after P and D? And there is this kind of ongoing question, because the Yahwist seems to favor an idea of covenant. So the central idea of the whole Hebrew Bible, the whole Old Testament, if you will, is this idea of covenant. And I often encourage my students to think of covenant really, I think to make the most sense of it or to make it interesting, you can think about covenant as a relationship, covenant as romance, a marriage. Like marriage, it's probably one of the closest analogies we have in our modern day world, where two people make an agreement, and the agreement becomes a third thing. There's you, there's me, and then there's our marriage, right? The marriage takes on a life of its own. It has legal ramifications. It has a legal existence. It has certain amount of kind of binding understandings, both cultural and legal, and breaking them also causes effects, right? It can cause very serious effects. And so this kind of covenant between God and God's people is the central character of this whole Hebrew Bible, and it will go through, these ups and downs, and the definition of this is a key issue. And so, at the heart of some of our questions, you may wonder, why do we care about Yahwist, Elohist, or priestly or Deuteronomic sources? Is there's a possible tension, which is also possibly, again, complementary, as to whether this covenant is unilateral or bilateral. Is it something in which one of the parties, God, of course, or Yahweh, unilaterally chooses the people and will carry out this covenant out of mercy and forgiveness and faithfulness, no matter what people do? Or is it bilateral? Does it require some response from the people, right? If they mess up, then they're in trouble, and this covenant can be broken. And in general, we will see that this kind of tension between the Yahwist, a little bit more on this unilateral side, and then the Deuteronomist or the Deuteronomic sources, materials, a little bit more on the bilateral side. And that is one of the primary tensions we're going to be dealing with throughout this kind of Pentateuch lecture. Okay, so the next chapter covers Genesis 1 through 11, which the authors have called primeval history. I think that's fair. This is kind of ancient history, time before time. It's God's creation. It's the first human beings. We see similarities to other ancient Near Eastern stories of creation. It's not clear who wrote it or when, right? It is pretty honest in talking about the faults of the patriarchs, right? They sell out their wives. They make mistakes. They have plenty of failures, and are these meant to be critiques? Is this some kind of an anti-king propaganda then? Are we thinking about a time of writing or editing or where these texts are set down in which some people are questioning the power of the kings? Or is it even later? Is it during the time of exile and return, right? If we remember the timeline of Israel, hopefully it's clear to you all, now that there's the stories, or it becomes clearer through these patriarchs, the kind of periods we're moving in. It's the kings and then the exile, right? Those are some of the later periods. These are some of the later periods in which we're usually thinking that these documents reach their final form, right? Whatever their sources, and then some major themes, right? If you bear down into the grammar, the Hebrew grammar, some very interesting ideas come out, right? Is this creation out of nothing? Is this the Trinity? Later interpreters have had a rich field to think about with Genesis standing as it does at the beginning, because there are some irregularities or fascinating points in which the Hebrew could be translated in multiple ways. God seems to speak in a plural, right? So Christians, of course, have loved to see the Trinity in that. Other major themes, right, that we're going to see coming again and again, is God creating order out of chaos, right? That there is a chaos, and then God is creating order out of it. The earth is or became waste and void in Genesis, the second verse. But then, from there on, it could be seen that God is trying to bring some order out of this waste and out of this void. And then there's this ongoing, contested, passionate relationship that I've encouraged you to think about with this covenant between humanity and God. This kind of either doomed or kind of blessed romance in which God is testing out his creation and trying to figure out how humanity will respond. And I do use this kind of male pronouns advisedly for God, partly because I think it stands in as this, it is, we will see throughout the Old Testament, this kind of imagined ideal of God is to some extent beyond gender, certainly. But in another sense, God stands in as the exemplar of a husband, of a wronged husband or a faithful husband with a traitorous wife, and people, all humanity, or Israel in particular, are seen as that part, playing that role. Moving on to chapter 3, we have now the ancestral saga. We have basically dominated, the second part of Genesis is dominated by the Abraham cycle and the Jacob cycle, with the Joseph novella, as the authors call it, as a nice kind of finish within the Jacob cycle. It's very unclear how much this is related to actual history, because they mainly focus on these patriarchs. There's very little that you can connect with historical records or kings or major figures that we have other external records. The main records we have of these people are these documents themselves. So did they happen? When did they happen? It's very hard to say. What we can say probably is that form criticism and logic itself, our understanding of these kind of documents, suggests that there is some sort of oral basis to this. So there's probably some sort of older oral tradition that these documents are based on, that they're coming from. But also, again, some of these criticisms, some of this open faults in these patriarchs, as just like in the primeval history, the criticism of the first humans, suggests some sort of an exilic flavor. People are trying to reflect why would people be so honest about their faults and the faults of their own great heroes of the past, should we say, the founders of their race, their nation, and their religion. It may be because they're thinking very deeply about exile and about their mistakes and what they can learn, from the past in trying not to repeat these in the future. There's this ongoing, in terms of the general theology of Genesis, the authors like to talk about these as curios or curiosities. There are some funny characters like Melchizedek. I'll call them funny, but I mean like mysterious. They have caused a lot of Jews and Christians to interpret them in very fascinating ways. Other occurrences like Joseph marrying an Egyptian priest's daughter, it seems like. But of course, the greatest one of all is the binding of Isaac, right? Perhaps the most poignant. Now, again, these lessons are not meant to replace the reading. You need to read them. You need to know the actual stories contained within them. But I think those are pretty readable and understandable. If you read through the textbook, it gives a pretty good overview of what actually Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and these patriarchal figures are doing in their families. The kind of great drama, narrative, soap opera of these people's lives. But maybe the most poignant, one of the most touching in all the literature we'll be reading, is this passage in which God comes to Abraham, now an old father, and after a long decades of this ongoing relationship between Abraham and God, God seems to test Abraham's faithfulness in the ultimate way, because the child of promise that Abraham has been waiting for so long, Isaac, God says, go and sacrifice him. And so it's often called the Agadah, the binding of Isaac. What is to be done with this, right? Obviously, Jews and Christians have had very different interpretations and ways of thinking about this. Obvious Christian interpretation is to think about Jesus and the death of God's own Son. An obvious Jewish one, thinking about faithfulness and the divine decree. In any case, we see that basic human tension between God and people and evil, and this recurrent tendency of humans to fail in this patriarchal period. Then we move on to Exodus, which is basically has four main parts. There's the story of Moses and the delivery from slavery in Egypt and suffering there, the plagues, and then Sinai. This is the kind of narrative part of Exodus, the story part, out of Egypt up to Sinai, and Moses as the main character, the one who delivers Israel. Then there's the law itself and the appearance of God at Sinai. That's the second section. Third, there's these guidelines given for what we'll call cultic worship, and by cult we don't mean like a strange religious group you need to watch out for, but cult in terms of specific religious forms and rituals related to religious services and practices, right? So here, sacrifice and worship and the construction of a holy place and the rules that will govern it. And then finally, the last kind of section of Exodus is the people's rebellion. So even as God is giving these rules and setting out the covenant, getting married to Israel, or making his promise, right? Betrothing himself, proposing to Israel using the covenant. I think this is a way to think about the giving of the covenant. I will give this covenant to you. I'm going to make a commitment. I'm going to commit myself to you in this relationship. Already, immediately, even as Moses is receiving these, the people are stepping out on the relationship. They are betraying God. They're creating these two golden calves in this kind of famous, infamous example of idolatry. They make these golden calves and worship them, even as God is telling them how they are meant to be his people. So this has huge kind of, Exodus has huge resonances with Jewish and Christian theology for obvious reasons. This kind of idea of delivery and covenant, especially for the Jewish tradition. Christianity sees Jesus, of course, in the character of Moses and liberation from sin and Satan and these kind of things. As far as history, right, is this true or not? There are these tantalizing clues of various periods in Egyptian history where this could have happened, right, where there may have been nomadic people, pastoralists living among the Egyptians, but there's also, no clear evidence for these kind of plagues or this, mass exodus of peoples. We could say it's ambiguous, right? Of course, we wouldn't imagine that Egyptian propaganda would want to talk about that, but, maybe, I don't know. There's good reasons for both doubters and believers to kind of read these tea leaves, but nothing conclusive in any case. And we see also that these stories themselves are probably influenced by Mesopotamian and Egyptian stories from around that time, or at least there's some very interesting parallels. Some of the things we see, blaming Aaron for the creation of these golden calves, the Levites' faithfulness may reflect later power struggles over the priesthood, right? Well, who has access to the temple? Is it the Levites? Is it only the descendants of Aaron? These are questions that may be coming up when we look at why some of these stories are preserved, how they're told that way. And then again, depending on whether we think the Yahwist or the priestly layer is first, we see various ideas on the different covenants, possibly updating each other or trying to modify each other. And then, like Genesis, we see some curious points. Why kill the males? Why kill the boys? Is that symbolic of something? Is there a deeper meaning? Again, like with the Genesis saga, there's some key, we could call theological issues too. A famous one here is, how can it be said, as Exodus does, that God hardens Pharaoh's heart? And this gets to the bottom line in some ways with this whole unilateral, bilateral question, the ongoing question in all these monotheistic faiths. Here we could even include Islam, right, between this problem of free will and divine predetermination. Can God, if God knows all our choices, or if God is in charge of how every atom in the universe bounces and moves and all these kind of things, where is the space for free will? And so can we say God hardens other people's hearts, and then how then can God blame them, right? It's this kind of ongoing issues. There's a lot of philosophical consideration of these outside of the Bible, but the Bible at least sets the stage and puts the questions out there. Finally, we can see the ongoing saga of what's set up in Genesis, of God struggling or working around human weakness and rebellion. Now we've moved out of the primeval age with these kind of ancient humans, Adam and Noah and such. We've moved past the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and now we're thinking about the people of Israel as a whole, but the themes are really still the same, right? Chaos, struggling, and evil. And out of it is there, God's law can be seen, and God's cultic instructions, and all these things can be a way of order, a way of allowing God's faithfulness to win the day in the end. We see more of this in the next book, Leviticus, which is not really a narrative now. There's not a story here, but more instructions, which really focuses on these kind of cultic practices related to worship, related to ritual, purity, priests, priest dress, priest service, priest responsibilities, a day of atonement set out, and then also kind of this famous holiness code, in which some of these famous like golden rule and things like that are set out, and also some of the uniquely Jewish and to some extent Christian ideas of what constitutes sin and holiness. One big question is why? Why all these rules about not eating pork or eating certain animals and not others? For a long time, some interpreters think of it as hygiene, right? Maybe this is an ancient healthcare, some way to keep people eating foods that are better for them. Maybe a deeper reflection on it might be some sort of idea of order and chaos, that God is bringing order to all of creation, that some things are in the boundaries, some things are out of the boundaries, and this helps give order to all the chaos of this multiple, vast, diverse world that we find ourselves in. Another one is like death versus life, right? The possibility of life coming out of death and avoiding death. A lot of the purity laws are anti-death, or are one of the most defiling things is seen to be death. And this can tap into this kind of deeper root of what God is trying to do from Genesis, right? And through Exodus, is to bring life and to bring order out of chaos, out of death. Okay, much of it obviously is another key point here is the condemnation of homosexuality is most clearly litigated in all these texts in Leviticus. And so this is a question too: is this based on order and chaos? Is it possibly related to idolatrous worship, which is mentioned in this context, in this forbidding of homosexual relations? In any case, we do have to recognize these are ancient texts. They're not dealing with these ideas psychologically in terms of sexual orientation or these kind of things. They're really dealing with acts, and they're doing this in this larger context of holiness and purity. So obviously, a lot of the source material is priestly here. I mean, since so much of it is worship focused on what priests should be doing and what people should be doing to maintain certain kind of holiness and purity in their sacrifices and in their daily lives. And theologically, if we step back again, we can see this as a practical answer to human failure, right? A way, again, one of the reasons ritual is so powerful in religion is that it gives order, right? Life is chaotic. There's things that happen to us. Our lives are not really in our hands, and the people and things we love best can be taken away at any moment. This is to be human, right? This is part of the struggle of being a human being, is to recognize, how much chaos and death there are. Well, ritual and these kind of sacrifices give a way to restore this relationship with God and to curb the power of death and to curb the kind of failures that we find ourselves in, or and a way to appease the mistakes, and a way to bring some order in this kind of unpredictability. We can follow the steps, simple steps to follow. The holiness code itself should be also understood as a very powerful kind of unique moment in this Pentateuch, where it really has a very idealistic view of all of God's people keeping themselves in a state of purity and holiness all the time. It has these powerful perfectionistic concepts that will have a huge resonance. In some ways, we could see all of Christianity is taking up this challenge of holiness, as Jesus is taking up this challenge of holiness. But we have to admit or say that even within Leviticus, it's like a special portion that imagines such a heightened view that not only are priests supposed to be holy, or not only are people supposed to be holy when they are sacrificing, but there is this kind of ideal that people will be holy all the time and will live in this kind of transcendent holiness. Moving on to this, we have Numbers. Numbers does have a narrative. We return to kind of the story as we had it, where the people of Israel are traveling from Sinai to the border of the Promised Land. And again, we see these signs, this focus on the land. There may be some editors or writers coming in with concerns from the period of exile and return from exile. Why is the focus on the land? This famous passage of Balaam, this foreign prophet who blesses Israel and promises them that they will live in the land, again, potentially, if they're thinking from an exile perspective, they're very focused on the land and what right they have, what reason they have to return to this land. In Numbers, a lot of the Yahwist and priestly materials are stitched together. Numbers also has some powerful messianic material, about Israel and Jacob ruling in this Balaam prophecy, in this prophet of Balaam, that becomes food for a lot of imagination for both Jews and Christians later on as they think about the possibilities of a kingdom and of a better order and a Messiah that will set things right. And then, so overall in Numbers, we get this blending of Yahwist and priestly perspectives. And if we want to think about them, how they could be blended together, we could say that there is a God who is dealing with human failures with mercy, that made this kind of covenant. And then the priestly material comes in as kind of a practical means of redemption. Sacrifice, temple, codes, all of these things allow people to restore that covenant that God has mercifully extended to people. And finally, we go to Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy really comes in last in this Pentateuch and makes sense, again, in both Jewish and Christian. All the canonical orders have Deuteronomy as this kind of linkage between the first 4 books of the Pentateuch and then these later books, because I think the close readers of these documents have seen the connections in which Deuteronomy continues the ideas. We were at the border of the promised land at Numbers, and Deuteronomy is Moses's kind of speech and repetition of the law right on the border of that promised land. But it also hints to these themes that will become increasingly important in these later historical books, Joshua, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, etc. And so after giving this prologue, of how the people get to that border of the land, Moses sets out the purpose of the law, which is to keep people in the proper covenantal relationship with God. In Deuteronomy, in this whole Deuteronomic connection, it mostly focused on the bilateral nature, if you remember, of where people are expected to do something also to keep this covenant, and there are consequences if they don't. So one of the things Deuteronomy emphasizes is worshiping in the place God will choose, right? So obviously they're not there yet. The city of Jerusalem is still in the future, but this is another sign that we have somebody coming from like the time of the kings or the time of the exile, because this kind of place God will choose, place God will choose, place God will choose is so emphasized and seems so clearly to point to Jerusalem, which becomes the center, political and religious center of Israel. Deuteronomy also tells people how they're supposed to live as another kind of giving of the law. It repeats some of the materials we had in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers about how they're supposed to live, they're supposed to keep their festivals and holy days. And then finally Deuteronomy kind of ends with Moses' final words, kind of famous final words, ringing in the ears of the people, that they are to be blessed if they keep the covenant, they will be cursed if they do not, and they are warned, right? Choose life that you may live in this promised land. So Deuteronomy does seem to contradict some of the earlier work. Its itinerary is different from Numbers, and in some ways it sets up the ideas that, as I said, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, these later books of history will address. So it's possible they're related, and they've often been called the Deuteronomic collection because of that, all these books. Again, this section in the library, if you will, of the Old Testament. So it's possible that Deuteronomy, for instance, is the book of the law that Josiah finds in 2nd Kings. We're going to get to this moment later in history, because a lot of Josiah's reforms about restoring the temple worship and Jerusalem seem very Deuteronomic. So this is one of Deuteronomy's central themes, centralizing, bringing people together, bringing people to worship the one God of Israel in one place. So there is that aspect of Deuteronomy. And then finally, the theology of Deuteronomy suggests that, it does have this, we have to be careful. So this is one of the themes we can explore, that you can explore in your essay, and potentially your midterm as well, is there's this kind of unilateral and bilateral. We've been making this distinction, but there's some ways where they may not be as distinct as possible, because here, or maybe not be so exclusive or contradictory as complementary. Let's put it that way. Because even here in Deuteronomy, where we have a lot of talk about, you have to choose life, or you will have these consequences, or you have to choose faithfulness, or there will be these consequences, there is this aspect of unilateral, where God's pure sovereignty, God's pure mercy, in the sense that He chose Israel, and it says, for no reason, basically, that purely out of God's own initiative, He chose Israel. There's no rhyme or reason. You are not the strongest people, you are not the greatest, the holiest, but God chose you because He wants you, He loves you, and so the still, the bulk of Deuteronomy is governed by this kind of basic requirement that God wants out of this covenant, which is faithfulness. Even though it mentions many, many sins, when it comes down to it, when Moses is warning the people what they're likely to get into, the problems they're likely to face in the new land, the new promised land, he comes back again and again and again to this one: idolatry, right? Which is like fundamental betrayal. If you want to think about the covenant, as I've been suggesting, as a kind of relationship, as a kind of marriage pact, then this is the point: is the covenant requires faithfulness on the people of Israel. Part of the people of Israel, God is jealous of their worship, and they keep worshiping other gods. And this is balanced out by that kind of famous line in Deuteronomy, potentially the most famous line in the entire Hebrew Bible. If you know anything about Jewish culture or worship, it's called the Shema, right? This prayer, again, maybe the most important prayer in Deuteronomy, that God is one and that the people are commanded to love God with all their heart, all their soul, all their strength. So this gives that very personal flavor, again, I think, to the whole Pentateuch, which keeps it from being, potentially a kind of boring academic discussion about laws and rules of life, and really makes it very, very personal, right? This is the people's rebellion, the people's idolatry is betrayal. It is, and God is walking this kind of fine line between justice and vengeance and mercy and love. This kind of dominates the Pentateuch, and these kind of tensions come out that characterize the entire work. Okay, so that is the 5 books of the law, or the Torah, the Pentateuch. Again, you need to read them. You should know these stories yourself. I haven't retold them because I don't think I can do a better job than the book does of telling the actual content of these, but I just want to give you a brief overview.